back-to-back league wins for Amorim, while on the other hand, Slot's Liverpool suffered 3 defeats on the trot. But amongst the most interesting things on display were the changed tactics from both managers, particularly Amorim's dynamic defensive shape, as well as how Slot looked to take advantage of this. So let's take a look at these tactics, starting with Liverpool in possession, as United's early lead changed the game state completely, meaning that the Reds dominated the ball. Early on, Liverpool's build-up shape was mainly a back three with either Bradley or Kirkish tucking in, but more important was what United looked to do in the press. Initially, it looked like the Red Devils were set up in a fairly conventional 5-4-1, but there were some major issues with this shape that we'll come on to later. The focus for now is the role of Cunha, who for most of the match was the highest forward, and he was the trigger that dictated how United defended. He tended to only press when Konate was on the ball if it was a back two, or Van Dijk if Kirkish had tucked in as the third centre-back. Either way, Cunha was the press trigger for Mbeumo to move from out to in to apply pressure on the left-sided outlet, so that the shape suddenly became a very lopsided 5-3-2. But especially when Kirkish was a little bit wider, if the left back was looking for room on the flank, it became Diallo's role to back up the press and give more shape to that United midfield, with De Ligt then moving slightly wider so that United were instantly in more of a 4-4-2, applying much higher pressure. And while this could work in theory, there were holes in this defensive structure, because firstly, in these initial phases, Gakpo was hugging the touchline, and because United's defensive shape was flexible, at times being a regular back 5, meaning that De Ligt could stay here, and at a moment's notice shift into a back 4, meaning that now De Ligt would have a lot of room to make up and try move to the right back zone in a short period of time. But Liverpool's use of midfield also made the 4-4-2 game plan a lot less effective. See, in this match, Gravenberch was a true solo pivot, maybe even a solo midfielder at times, because it was extremely rare to see either McAllister or Szoboszlai dropping deep to assist him, and instead they stayed high between the lines, and that meant when United were in a back 5, De Ligt's attention was on the midfielder between the lines, so shifting to a 4 would have meant leaving a man free between the lines. So this could lead to some indecision from the centre-back on who to pick up, like we see here, as Cunha starts the press, meaning Mbeumo moves high with him, leaving Kirkish completely unmarked, and 2 things happen. Diallo begins to back up the press onto the left back like we've discussed, and De Ligt is still drawn to the midfielder. So as McAllister drops, De Ligt follows, meaning that Gakpo has acres of space to run into. And as the first half wore on, we saw Kirkish begin to vary his position a lot more, not just staying wide behind the presser, but now also moving inside into this slot, which was a lot harder for Diallo to follow into because he still had to worry about Gakpo wide, and this made it a lot easier for Kirkish to receive. And in fact, this left side triangle were in constant rotation, making it much harder for United to keep track of singular men, and it is a surprise that not much came from the left side threat. But we mentioned that Gravenberch was a solo midfielder at times, but there's a reason we don't see many top teams adopt such a shape. It creates a single point of failure. If the defensive team is able to cut out the pivot entirely, progression down the flanks becomes slow and predictable. Or if they can press them strategically, they can win the ball back and be running at the defense instantly. But before he came off, Gravenberch faced exactly 0 of these issues and was able to dictate the game completely, having the second most touches. And this was because when United were in their 5-4-1, rather than keeping Cunha high 2 versus 1 down, where he wouldn't have had much success anyway, it would have been a lot better to have him deep, tying up Gravenberch and forcing the centre-backs to make the riskier progressive passes. But in this encounter, Cunha rarely did this, either through Amorim's choice or Cunha not having the discipline, meaning that Gravenberch got on the ball easily. So it could lead to situations like this, where Cunha and Mbeumo pressed ahead of Gravenberch. But because of no pressure, Gravenberch receives effortlessly, and in mere seconds, Liverpool are in the final third, attacking the United box. And why were neither of the pivots backing up the press? Because when they did, you got situations like this, where Fernandes is high up the pitch and Casemiro is left 2 versus 1 down against the Liverpool pivots. And even when they arrived high up the pitch, this was one of Liverpool's chief aims, having multiple men between the lines who they could look to play into. So it was rarely just these 2 between the lines. When Kirkish was wide, Gakpo moved infield, and Salah could do similarly on the opposite side if Bradley was providing the width. And here's the thing, Liverpool were consistently having success with this, with players able to receive between the lines but just never able to find that killer pass. defense. And Isak, as well as the fullbacks, were key, as Liverpool continued to try and break down the United defense. Instead of being in the front line like a traditional line, Isak almost permanently took up this role, which had two effects. Firstly, it meant that the central centre-back had no direct reference point, so he found himself being drawn higher up the pitch onto one of the midfielders between the lines, much like De Ligt, while at the same time, the left centre-back had to drop with Isak, making the backline a lot more unsteady. So, from this shape, the Liverpool fullbacks looked to be the men to break the crooked line, be it Kerkers from the left or Bradley down the right. And we saw things like this situation down the right, where again we see a midfielder drawn to Gravenberch, and with Isak having dropped deep, the gap in the backline is clear. This allows a man to receive between the lines and potentially play into that hole. So as the game went on, rather than change the shape to one with more direct midfield protection, Amorim just changed the spaces that his players took up, with the midfield four now defending a lot narrower and deeper, making it much harder to find those piercing passes between the lines. But in all of this, United looked dangerous, firstly in the counter-attack, especially when Kerkers had pushed higher up in attack. And just quickly, if you're enjoying this video, you probably like tactics in general, and I've put together Tactics 12 for you. Tactics 12 is my free program, where over the course of 12 days, I'll teach you the basics of tactical analysis. If that sounds good to you, check it out through the top link in the description. Mbeumo's positioning, though it did cause issues on the defensive end of things, left him perfectly positioned to take advantage of the space behind the fullback. And with Liverpool's rest defense being fairly high, it meant that Fernandes had acres of space to hit on the transition, which he did more than once. And when Liverpool made a raft of changes, switching to a 4-4-2/4-2-4 when they were chasing the game, it left the midfield looking extremely sparse, especially because both of these men would often look to take advantage of the space outside of United's narrow midfield. Despite Szoboszlai inverting from right back to try and provide more steel in the midfield, United still found it much easier to walk the way through the centre after Liverpool changed shape. But even in controlled possession, United identified the weakness in Liverpool. In general, United took no risks, probably due to going ahead so early, and United constantly went long under any pressure. But when they did have some control, we saw a tweak in Liverpool's pressing shape. Often this season, we've seen Liverpool press in more of a 4-4-2 or even a 3-5-2, with Salah coming in to join the forward and Gakpo dropping deep. But because of United's back three today, Liverpool's front three simply went man-to-man, and this was frankly disastrous. United didn't have to do anything dramatic. A simple ball to the wing-back would often see Diallo get into isolations against Kerkers. And that was probably one of the better scenarios, because even more than that, the movement of the fullback left a massive gap between himself and Van Dijk, meaning either Cunha or Mbeumo constantly had acres of room in the half space to run into, or to just receive and then play infield, meaning despite having just a fraction of the possession, United often looked just as dangerous as Liverpool. But I would love to hear from you in the comments. Was this a well-deserved win for United and the start of something great? And should Liverpool change anything tactically to get back on track? Leave it down below. And Amorim uses his 3-4-3 much differently to many other managers. If you want to explore the differences between Amorim's 3-4-3 and Tuchel's Champions League winning 3-4-3, check out this video linked on screen now.